to Psalm 78. Psalm 78. Now, of course, this psalm is going to be too long to read all the way through because it's got 72 verses. So we're going to try to give a synopsis of the psalm. And it's pretty easy because so much of it is historical illustrations that we already know about in the Bible. And he's just giving us a good history lesson that with most of these, if not all of them, the illustrations are recorded in the Bible. Now, again, we see that it's a song of Asaph. We don't know exactly which Asaph. Asaph may have been a group of men together or Levites together that wrote the Psalms, and that was their name. We know that there was an Asaph in David's time. We know there was an Asaph in Hezekiah's time. We see Asaph in obvious the times of David, and then we see them also as we saw last week in Psalm 77, obviously in the time at the end of the monarchy and end of the kingdom of Judah. And then we also see an Asaph in Hezekiah, which would have been about 150 to 175 years before the last Asaph, which we saw last week. But we see now that this man is really concerned about warnings. And this is a great time to do this. Whenever we have the New Year's, we reflect on what has happened. We make our plans for the future. And it's good to look back and to reflect on what God has done, what God is doing, and then the lessons that we've learned, both from ourselves and from others, and also from history. Now, we see here, like we said, Psalm 78 then is a really it's a teaching psalm, and it's teaching about history. It's teaching one generation the importance of teaching the next generation about what God has done. One of the things that the communists realized that one of the best ways to destroy a country and to undermine its cohesiveness is to destroy its history, that the people don't know, they don't have any heroes, they don't have, or if they could rob them of anything except the things that are bad, then they can pretty well take a person's pride away from their country. You say, well, look at the United States. Have we had a lot of problems? Yes. But has God blessed us in spite of those problems at times? Yes. Are there things that we still have problems today because of the sins of the past? Yes. But name one country in the history of the world, including any country in the world today, that has not had the same problem. Think about if we were German Christians in Germany. Do you think we might have a few things that we would like to forget about our past? Think about Britain. I mean, you think about some of the things they have done in England and some of the bad things that has happened during their history, even recently. And then you name France, name the country, Russia, name the country. And yet, in all that, we see that God has definitely blessed this country above all measure, like he did Israel. So we see now that we're going to read the first 8 verses because this is pertinent to the rest of the psalm. But he says, "Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old." So I'm going to go back now. Why should they be dark sayings? Because he is implying that these people haven't learned their history. And as we said here in the notes, one of the sad facts about history is that people don't learn from their history. And so he says, I'm going to go back through some things. Now, he doesn't always do it in order. Sometimes he kind of flip-flops, but he's going to hit on some of the highlights of Israel's history. He says, the dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from our children. No, we're not going to hide the bad things from the good things. No, we need to learn from both. Telling to the generation to come the praises of the Lord. There it is. That's the key to the whole psalm. is we're going to teach children, and we want to make sure that the next generation has the knowledge of God and what God has done in our country, both personally as well as nationally, and how that He has blessed us. And of course, Israel being God's chosen people, they have a lot of heritage, just like our country does, because of how that our country was formed around religious freedom. But he says, and His strength and His wonderful works that He has done, for He established a testimony in Jacob, and He appointed a law in Israel, which He commanded our fathers that they should make them known to their children. There it is again. If you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 6, Hear, O Israel, the Lord thy God is one God, and you shall teach your children, your sons and your sons' sons. And so it's very important that we teach our children and our grandchildren the things that God has done. And unfortunately, some of us don't know much because our grandfathers and our fathers didn't teach us much about history. And how sad that is. That's why in my ministry, I try to lace a lot of my messages with history, because we need to go back to our heritage. Schools are not doing today. They're teaching all kinds of critical race theory and all kinds of other things, and all the things that are bad about the country. But we don't see much on what was good. We don't hear about the heroes like George Washington or who you name, several, the great heroes of the past. The statues are being torn down and all the rest. So he says that the generation to come might know them, that the children who would be born, that they may arise and declare them to their children, that they may set their hope in God and not forget the works of God, but keep His commandments, and he may not be like their fathers, a stubborn and rebellious generation, a generation that did not set its heart aright, and whose spirit was not faithful to God. So we see now the prelude as the Lord introduces, or through Asaph. We see now that the purpose is we want to teach the children or the generation to come what God has done. Oh, it's so important that we know what God has done. America, God has shed thy grace on thee. Well, how? How did God protect us? How did God watch over us? How did God give us this religious freedom? Who died for us? You know, we talk about all that. Who are our heroes? What made them good, and what made them, in some cases, good in spite of their weaknesses? And you'll notice in the Bible, all the great men that were given a lot of verses, except for Daniel and for Joseph, which we don't see any, except for Joseph. There may have been there a little bit of indiscretion in talking to his brothers about what God had told him to do as a teenager. But other than that, Daniel and Joseph are the two that we don't see really did horrible things. But you talk Moses, did he? You did David? Yes. Did did Abraham? Yes. You name the prophet. Did Solomon? Yes. Did David? Yes. And so you name the man, and you will see that God shows us how that He could bless in spite sometimes the weaknesses. The one thing I like about historians, if I read their books, is if they're going to tell me how great the man or the woman was, then tell me objectively. Tell me some things. Don't tell me, you don't have to go in detail, but they were people like us. One of the bad things about George Washington was there was a guy, he was a preacher by the name of Parson Reams. I think he was Episcopal or whatever. But he wrote a bunch of books on the hero about George Washington. And George Washington could throw a coin across the Potomac, which in some places would be quite a trek, or quite a trip. And so, and then what's that? Yeah, about 2 miles across. Yeah. Tell me that he can do that. And he threw a silver dollar across. Well, we're not even sure we had silver dollars back then, but it's all these things. He chopped down the cherry tree and all this. So, and Father, I cannot tell a lie. There's no recorded instance that he ever did that. In fact, his father died at a pretty early age for George Washington. And so all those different things, did George Washington have some problems? There are certain things about George Washington that I don't like. And one was that he was one of the largest distillers in America. He made a lot of whiskey, made a lot of money off of it. There again, I shouldn't have told you about that because now you'll remember George Washington, but he wasn't a drunkard or anything like that, but he did have his strengths and he had his weaknesses. And so we see that Israel's past was a result of their unfaithfulness to God. And it's noted now all the things that God had done. And so in the first section, in verses 9 through 16, we see that the Lord tells us now, he's going to mention Ephraim. Ephraim is both a tribe and many times is the name of the northern 10 tribes that were the tribes that departed from Israel. And because it was the major tribe, God would say, "O Ephraim," rather than northern Israel. And so Ephraim is both a tribe as well as a representative of all the tribes of northern Israel. And so we see that the children of Ephraim, being armed and carrying bows, turned back in the day of battle. They did not keep the covenants of God. They refused to walk in his law and forgot his works and his wonders that he had shown them. One thing you'll notice about Ephraim is, of course, Ephraim was going to be the firstborn. It was, as far back with Joseph and the blessings that were passed on to him from his father Jacob. Ephraim was going to be a major tribe. But unfortunately, Ephraim always seemed to be rebellious. About the best guy that came out of Ephraim was of course, Joshua. But you'll notice time after time, Ephraim, the lead tribe, is the tribe that causes the rebellion. Or as we see here, they turn back from the day of battle. We see that repeatedly in the book of Judges and in the book of Samuel, You look back at Jephthah. Jephthah was calling all the tribes together and let's go and let's beat the Amalekites. And it was only after Jephthah had won some major battles, but then Ephraim got mad because, hey, why didn't you let us lead? Well, wait a minute, you could have been with Deborah. Same way, she had a lot of people around her, but the Ephraimites kind of stayed back. You look at Jeroboam. Jeroboam, of course, split up those tribes, and he was rebellious against God, and he set up all the idols, both in Bethel and Ai, and he was an Ephraimite. You look time after time, the Ephraimites were fierce battle, and when they were on your side, that's the best tribe, and of course they were leaders of the other tribes. But when they were against you, then they caused all kinds of problems. And they had a history of causing all kinds of problems, unfortunately. And so we see that they turned back in the day of battle, that they did notice the verse 10, they refused. It wasn't that they just didn't or forgot, but they refused to walk in his law. They said, that's not for us. I'm just not going to do it. And then we see that they forgot his works. So this was their major problem. Now in saying that then, we'll see, and the rest of the book is all about God's gracious dealings with Ephraim and all of Israel, in spite of the fact that they rebelled against him repeatedly. Aren't you glad that God hasn't given up on you yet? Anybody here this past year had to ask God to forgive you over and over again, sometimes for the same sin? No, we all don't learn, do we? Aren't you glad we have a patient God? Aren't you glad we have a gracious God? And yet we see here that God was gracious in spite of these people's rebellion. Sometimes I see people in great rebellion against God. And my instance is say, Lord, punish them. But then again, whoa, wait a minute, Lord, I don't want you to punish me. So I'm sure I'm glad that you've been patient with me. And so again, we see that that God is gracious, and many times whenever you see that person slowly broken, and you're wanting God to go ahead and take care of it tonight, but it might be a few weeks or a few years before that person gets right with God. And so here we see that in verse 9, verse 12, he says, marvelous things. Now notice you'll see one thing throughout the rest of the psalm, the contrast between God's graciousness and Israel's rebellion. Time after time, he's just going to, the rest of the chapter or the rest of the psalm is about that. So he says, marvelous things he did in the sight of our fathers. Notice he did them, and everybody saw it. It was obvious. And this was what was supposed to be passed on to us. But he says, in the land of Egypt, in the field of Zoan, he divided the sea. When did that happen? Of course, the book of Exodus. And he made the waters to stand up in a heap. Verse 14, in the daytime also he led them by a cloud. Remember the cloud by day and the fire by night. In verse 15, he split the rocks in the wilderness and he gave them drink. And so notice he goes from the Exodus to the wilderness. And in the wilderness, did the Lord split the rocks? Yes, water came from the rock. And so all these things that they did, and they obviously saw them. But notice in verse 17, the contrast. But they sinned even more against him, and by rebelling against the Most High in the wilderness. Now, can we think of many times in the wilderness? If you've read the book of Exodus, Exodus, Numbers, how many times they rebelled against God. And so they tested the Lord in their heart, verse 18, by asking him food of their fancy. We're tired of out here eating nothing. In fact, whenever he gave them manna, we're tired of the manna. And so no matter what he gave them, it wasn't what they were never satisfied. Verse 19, yet they spoke against God, and they said, can God prepare a table in the wilderness? Behold, he struck a rock so that the waters gushed out and the streams overflowed. Can he make bread also? And of course, they did. He did. Can he provide meat for his people? Yes, he did that too. Therefore, the Lord heard this and was furious. Now, God wasn't mad with them because they asked for food. It was that God was upset with them because no matter what he did for them, it was never good enough, and it never prepared them for saying, Lord, you've done it before, you can do it again. It was always, Lord, you've left us out here in the wilderness. It's the time for we're going to have to kill Moses and go back to Egypt. Over and over again. Any little test that came along, I give up, I'm out of here. The same way that we see that people do with the Lord. What does it take to stop you from serving the Lord? Oh, I don't want to be embarrassed by God's people. Or all kinds of things that people come up with. Therefore, the Lord heard and was furious, so a fire was kindled against them, and we remember those things that happened. And anger came up against Israel. We know that he called fire down a couple of times in the wilderness because they did not believe in God and did not trust in his salvation. Notice now, not all the people, not all the Israelites that came out of Egypt are in heaven today. Some of them, no matter what God did, they did not have faith. What is it? Abraham believed God, and it was counted unto him for righteousness. Some of these people never believed, and so they were never counted as the righteous. And so we see that that they just rebelled against God. Verse 17, because they did not believe God, did not trust in his salvation. But he had commanded the clouds above. No, he just says he rained down manna on them to eat in verse 14, verse 24, and given them the bread of heaven, and men ate angels' food. Notice, he's really getting flowery here, isn't he? Bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. And of course, we know the Lord Jesus Christ was that manna. He was the bread of life. And angels' food. God fed his people, and that wasn't angel food cake either. That was some good stuff. And he called the east wind to blow in the heavens, and by his power he brought out the south wind, and he rained meat on them, and all these different things that he did in the wilderness. Remember, he fed them with quail, and he fed them with all kinds of other, whenever they were down, even though they griped against him. Now, a couple of times, one time he fed them with quail, but then he killed some of them with quail still in their mouth because he was so upset with them. So they ate and were filled, but he gave them their own desire. They were not deprived of their craving, but while their food was still in their mouths, the wrath of God came out against them. So notice how that he goes back and reminds them of this people, of this. Notice in verse 32, in spite of this, they still sinned. Notice what all God did, the contrast, in spite of this, they still sinned. It did not believe in his wondrous works. Therefore, their days he consumed in futility, and their years in fear. Over 3,000 funerals a day in the wilderness, if they had 2.5 million people out there. Every day there was funerals going on. He slew them. Then they sought him. Verse 24. And they returned and sought earnestly for God. Now here we have in verse 20 we have a summary of their shallow repentance. I mean, oh Lord, forgive us because we don't want your double whammy to fall upon us. We don't want to be hurt. It's one thing that, Lord, I have sinned, and my relationship with you is not right, and I've sinned against you and against a lot of other people. It's another thing to say, Lord, forgive me of my sins because I don't want to be hurt. Big difference. Now, of course, we don't want to be hurt, and that's one reason we ask for his mercy. But the objective of repentance is to get our hearts right with God. And so he says that, and they remembered that not that God was their rock, verse 35, and the Most High, their Redeemer, capital R, neither they flattered him with their mouth, and they lied to him with their tongue. Lord, if you'll just do this, I'll do anything. Lord, if you get me out of this mess, we'll serve you forever. Foxhole. I call those foxhole professions or confessions. Lord, you just get me out of this big trouble, and you let me live through all this, and I'll serve you. And then when the person died, and I know several people who did that, and I've talked with them, and I reminded them of what they told the Lord that they would do if they got him out of that mess. Oh, Pastor, you know how it is. You know, just you'll say anything whenever you get in trouble, whatever. And they have all kinds of excuses. Well, I was going to serve God, but I went to your church, and man, they're just all those people aren't any better than I am. Well, join the crowd. We're all a bunch of sinners, needing God's grace. But they have all kinds of excuses why they won't serve God after that. And then there's what we call landmark decisions, where you can look back on the day that God changed your life, where you said, Lord, I'm going to serve you. Yes, I might have fallen, but that was the day that I started changing for God. And so we don't see that. We see a lot of foxhole decisions with the Ephraimites or with Israel, but we don't see the landmark decisions. In verse 36 then, nevertheless, they flattered him with their mouth, and they lied to him with their tongue, for their heart was not steadfast with him, nor were they faithful in his covenant. Notice they weren't faithful, but he was. But he, being full of compassion, forgave their iniquity. It did not destroy them. Yet many a time he turned his anger away, and he did not stir up all of his wrath. Then verse 39 is a great verse. For he remembered that they were but flesh. A breath that passes away does not come again. And so he remembers our frame that we're but dust. And yet, in all their weaknesses, he still loved them. But then notice in verse 40, we see again the contrast between Israel's infidelity and God's mighty works. He just keeps on. He just keeps pouring it on. How often They provoked him in the wilderness. Notice he goes back, he flip-flops, he goes back and forth on the things that happened, and grieved him in the desert. Yet, yes, again and again, they tempted God and limited the Holy One of Israel. They did not remember his power. They did not remember his power. The day when he redeemed them from the enemy, when he worked his signs in Egypt and his wonders in the field of Zoan. Now, whenever God deals with us, one of the best ways to remember his power is to thank him. Many times I tell people, write it down in the flyleaf of your Bible. Something where God obviously answered something in your life. Make it a landmark. Make it something in your life. I was talking to Al the other day. We were talking about some things, and I was talking to him, and I said, who was it? I think someone else here. But I could remember to the day when God really got a hold of me and about certain things in my life and about was I going to serve him or not. I could go back to 1979. The Chiefs were playing the Jets in the playoff game, and Joe Namath was the quarterback in Shea Stadium. And this is the year after the Jets won the Super Bowl, and he got his hand hurt and all that. And the Jets lost to the Kansas City Chiefs, and that's the first time they won the Super Bowl. But I was sitting on the USS Beatty, and God was dealing with me. And I've never been the same since. What? 79? No, I'm sorry. I was 69, 1969. Boy, 10 years in. Because 79 is when I got married. Well, my wife said that was a big change, or 1980 was, but 79 is when I asked her, but boy, that was a big change too. Sorry, dear. She'll straighten me out. But took the Lord 10 years to get me ready for her. But there again, I can look back on those things and say, Lord, it's been a long trek, and I could look back now at all the times I failed him, but he's never failed me. You know, I can look back. I wish there was times when I said, boy, there was another landmark decision, and I've never had that problem again. Ooh, I wish I could say that, but none of us can. But there are those landmark changes where you've seen God work. Now, did I immediately just, whatever, cold turkey, do everything right? No, obviously. There was a lot of things that had to be done and all the rough edges. But that's the way it is in our lives when God deals with us. And these people, they didn't remember his power. The day when he redeemed them from the enemy, when he worked his signs in Egypt. Boy, that should have been a big time, especially those 10 plagues. And of course, when he turned the rivers to blood and their streams that they could not drink, of course, that was the Nile. He sent swarms, and so he's going through all those 10 plagues, or not all of them, but most of them here, that were dealt with. And that was such a powerful statement. And you will see, as we've said several times, Israel, when they go back and look at their history, they always go back to Egypt and the Red Sea crossing, because that was their time of redemption. That was the time God changed Israel. He set up a whole new calendar for them, and the Passover. And then from the Passover, you have the Red Sea crossing. And the Red Sea crossing, you have the covenant in Sinai. And then you have just those strings, the 40 years wanderings, and then you have the crossing of the Jordan and Jericho, and all those. Those were major landmarks that wouldn't be very difficult to teach to your children, and to remember the power that God had in their lives. And so he goes back through all this, but we see he made in verse 48. He says he gave their flocks to the hail, and talks about what he did. He made, in verse 50, he made a path for his anger, and he did not spare the soul from death. That was the death of the firstborn, but gave life over the plague. Of course, when I see the blood, I will pass over you. And he destroyed the firstborn of Egypt, and he goes right on just in detail. He says, In verse 52, but he made his own people go forth like sheep, and he guided them in the wilderness like a flock, and he led them on safely so that they did not fear. But the sea overwhelmed their enemies, and he brought them. Notice how he's going back through that again. And that should have been etched into the consciousness of the people. Why does the Star Spangled Banner, why should it be so special? Because it was one of the great deliverances of the United States, and how that England should have destroyed us as a country in that battle. And yet, when the rockets' red glare, the bombs through the night and so forth, when I awoke, when the dawn's early light, what happened? The flag was still there. It was a major miracle. And of course, we sing about that today, but most people don't even know what they're singing. But oh, that we would go back and look at what God has done in our country, time after time. Were we perfect? No. Was the guy who wrote that psalm perfect? No. You can go back and look at some things, and I'm not going to tell you some of the things about Francis Scott Key that were bad, because that's what people will hold on. But he was a man who, at his time, was wanting to live for God. He was a Christian. And if you'll notice that second stanza, he mentions God and how that God was the one who delivered the United States. And so that's one of our major landmarks in our country. We can look back at several. Gettysburg was another time. Pearl Harbor was another time. And not only was it a devastation, but the Japanese should have blown us out. I mean, there were just so many things that they didn't do that gave us a chance to fight back. And so over and over again, we've seen God deliver Midway, of course, which was a major battle, and that turned the whole course of the war. And so then that's not only that, we can look at the heroes that weren't in battle. George Washington Carver and Jonas Salk and all these people who gave us great deliverances from diseases, or helped us in our nutrition. So we see that God has blessed us, but how many of our children even know and would know who Francis Scott Key is? And the Battle of Gettysburg, what does that mean? What was it about? They did something even with college students, where they put a lot of questions, like what happened, when did World War II start? And they'd say 1865 or so. They had no idea the timeline of our country. Those are college students. It's amazing some of the things that happen because we don't know our history. And when we don't know our history, then we don't know our heritage, and we don't know what God's really done for us. And that is why it's so important for us to let our children know what God's done for us and how that he's blessed us. And so we see the contrast between these two things. Notice in verse 54, he brought them to his holy border in the mountain, which it was his right hand had acquired. And also he drove out the nations before them and allotted them their inheritance by survey. Go back to the book of Joshua for that. And made the tribes of Israel dwell in their tents. Yet they tested and provoked him of the Most High, verse 56, and did not keep his testimonies, and turned back and acted unfaithfully like their fathers. So notice now this is generational. Not only now have the people died in the wilderness, but now their children, after they have been delivered into the land, they act just like their fathers did. And they turned aside like a deceitful bow, and they provided him, and they provoked him to anger with their high places, and moved him to jealousy with their carved images. And that was one of their repeated sins throughout their history. So he just goes right on down. In verse 61, but notice the contrast, he delivered them and delivered his strength into captivity, and his glory into the enemy's hand. So he says, okay, if my power doesn't work for you, then my power will work against you. And he gave the people over to the sword and the fear. So he really punished them. And should we not learn from those who have gone before us? Should not be a deterrent when we see someone that we love or someone that was maybe And should we not learn from Moses' mistake or Abraham's mistake or Peter's mistakes? Should we not learn from those things, or our older brothers or sisters' mistakes, or someone in the church so you saw them fall? Should we not learn from those things? And should we not say, Lord, no, we don't say, but Lord, I would never do that. No, but Lord, by your grace, whenever I hear of a pastor who falls into sin, or you hear some that destroys their reputation, I don't say, ha ha, boy, I knew that, even though I might have thought about that. But the first thing I do is say, Lord, please don't let it happen to me. Please, Lord, by your grace, I'd be right in that same position. And so I want to make sure that I don't, go around tooting my horn, because pride goes before a what? Before a fall. And so we see that fire consumed the young men, and the maidens were not given to marriage. Verse 64, and the priest fell by the sword, and the widows made no lamentation, their lamentation. And so, boy, that's pretty bad when your wife won't even cry for you. And so we see how bad things happened. Well, let's go back. That's verse 65 now. We see, but the Lord awoke from his sleep. Now, does God sleep or slumber? We sing the song, he neither slumbers nor sleep. No, of course he doesn't. This is poetic justice, where he is saying, God just, to us, he would have waken up and given us attention. But God doesn't, but God made himself known again. Have there been times when you wonder where God is? And you feel like if there is a God, he must be 100 miles away from you? Well, yeah, we all feel that way at times. But notice God awoke from his sleep like a mighty man who shouts because of wine, and he beat back his enemies, and he put them in perpetual reproach. Moreover, he rejected the tent of Joseph, Ephraim. So notice, first of all, the faithful care that God had when he established his kingdom. Of course, he said he was going to establish his kingdom through David forever. And so we see that the first thing he did, he rejected Ephraim and chose Judah. And so we see, moreover, he rejected the tent of Joseph and did not choose the tribe of Ephraim, but he chose the tribe of Judah, Mount Zion. Of course, that's where the temple was built, which he loved. And he built his sanctuary like the heights, like the earth which was established forever. And he chose, so first of all, we see that he established his kingdom. He established the boundaries. But then also in verses 6, from there on, we see that in verse 70, he chose David, his servant, and took from the sheepfolds. What was David? He was a shepherd. From following the ewes that he had young, he brought them to shepherd Jacob, his family, or his people, and Israel his inheritance. Notice how that David becomes the shepherd. The Lord is my shepherd, and of course then we talk about God being the good shepherd. So he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart, and he guided them by the skillfulness of his hands. Isn't that a good way to finish it? Now, is he talking about David there, or is he talking about the Lord? Both. As long as David was right with God, and when God used David, and he guided David, David was a man after God's own heart. Was David skillful? But he had even more skillful God. Were there things that David couldn't do unless God helped him? Yes. And so it was both David working hand in glove, if you want to say that, with the Lord. But he shepherded them according to the integrity of his heart, and he guided them by the skillfulness of his hand. Oh, Lord, guide me. Guide me, O thou great Jehovah, pilgrim in a barren land. I am weak, but thou art mighty. So here we see, bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Okay. Any questions or comments about what we've looked at tonight? this is something we should think about. Let's go back over the next, 3 or 4 days. This 28th is 3 days. Look back at what God has done in your life. Look at, think of some things that maybe in your history or in the nation's history where obviously God has greatly blessed. This is a great time of reflection. And then instead of being like our fathers and like the baby boom generation that turned against God, and that's the reason we're having trouble today with X, Y, Z, millennials and all the rest, is because we consciously turned away from God during my generation. And we're reaping a whirlwind as a result. And so there again, can we trust God in these times of peril? Yes.